thank you very much for coming for this seminar. I'd just like to say now it's going to be an open lunch, so if you want to tweet or write about anything after the event, that's absolutely fine, unless, of course, the presenters mention as such. So, with respect to that. Just to introduce, this week the UN is hosting the high-level political forum on sustainable development, and on Tuesday, SDG 4 was under the spotlight for scrutiny on implementation. Leading up to that, we saw UIS, amongst others, publish some pretty grim stats on progress or lack of progress against the goals, but I don't suppose that was particularly surprising to many of us around the table. This has then been joined by an argument that more business as usual isn't going to work. We need to do more that is different, not more of the same, if we're going to achieve goals by 2030. And others have then followed with calls for manifold increases in aid finance, for more commitment to the goals, whatever that might mean. And we will wait to see whether the delegates at the political forum take advantage of what has been billed an unprecedented opportunity to talk to each other and learn from each other. Which brings us to today's seminar, titled, Is the International Aid Architecture for Education Failing the World? And of course, most of that news isn't really new, including the calls for reform to the education aid architecture. And one great example of that is Nicholas Burnett's invited essay that's in this month's IGED issue. Not sure whether it's yet online. Nick and I couldn't work it out, but it's available. Also, if anyone wants to read it afterwards, Nicholas can share it with you. Titled, It's Past Time to Fix the Broken International Architecture for Education. And so we thought it would be a good idea to take the opportunity to convene this seminar and talk to each other and learn a little bit from each other. So I'm delighted to host, on behalf of CGD Europe, Nicholas Burnett, a senior fellow at R4D, who will present his case and argument around the international aid architecture failing to deliver. And we also are joined by Sally Gear, Head of Profession for Education at DFID, who will provide us with some reflections from the donor perspective and in particular from country education advisors working in various DFID locations. And also Joseph Nhan-O'Reilly. Sorry. How's it correctly pronounced?
That's perfect.
Who is Head of Education Policy and Advocacy at Save the Children, and who will reflect on some of the current challenges on financing in particular within the aid architecture. We'll see Nick present for about 25 minutes, then 10 minutes each from the discussants, and then we should allow ourselves about 45 minutes for discussion and questions. If there aren't any questions now, I'll pass it over to Nicholas to please begin.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think probably easiest if I stand. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. So as Jack just said, I recently published an article, well, an essay rather. It's not a scientifically evidence-based, fully evidence-based article in IGED. But I've been thinking about these issues for some time, and also some of these issues have been on my own conscience as somebody who's had fairly high-level jobs in a couple of major agencies involved with education, the World Bank and UNESCO. Sorry, by standing on this side, you can see me not with such a reflection. So I have to stand on this side. That still work for the camera for the remote people? Yeah. Okay. So what's been bothering me over the last few years have been a series of questions. These are just a few of them. Why have we paid so little attention? Why is there such weak global leadership around education? Why is there no one agency or no set of agencies to be bringing about change? Why are global public goods in education so underfunded? Statistics, support, speak, but I mean, it's about to go under, frankly. Just about surviving. And, why is it that the sort of current theme is to take a systems approach? And every single agency says this, except we don't take it about the architecture. So, real contradiction. So these have been some of the things which led me to try to put this together. But what I will try to do, which is maybe quite difficult in 25 minutes, so I may skip some bits of this, is basically run through what I think the architecture is, why it matters, what's needed in it, what's condition it's in, what we might learn from others, what I think might be feasible to do today. So first of all, just defining it. Nothing very profound here. Just talking about it being a set of international agencies and institutions that receive international resources to support the country's educational development. So I've excluded for this purpose, for this discussion, the bilateral agencies. So of course, many of them are in fact the source of the resources for the international. I want to focus particularly on the international agencies, but one of the criticisms that's been rightly made of what I wrote has been that you didn't go after USAID and give it also, but I'm happy to have a go at that. And obviously the architecture also, especially bits like PISA and so on, applies very much to all countries, including OECD. Obviously here at CGD we're talking about 12 countries. So, there's a lot of institutions involved. You can read, I'm not going to read them all out. There are financing institutions, there are knowledge institutions, there are assessment institutions, etc., etc. There are all different types of funders and so on. So it's actually quite a large set of institutions, but it's very, very fragmented. And this probably you can't read, but it doesn't really matter. The point was just we made a small attempt to find out how many people might be working in these international agencies. And actually, it depends crucially on whether or not you include everybody who works for UNICEF. But something like 2,000 people, that's the order of magnitude, are working on education in these agencies. That's a significant number of people if they were working all towards the same objectives. But maybe it's quite a small number of people if they're all working separately. This excludes, of course, bilateral. Why does the architecture matter? Well, obviously, we don't need to persuade people. Perhaps I could, but anyway, I'm not planning to persuade people in this room why education matters. But it's not just a question of SDG 4, I would argue. There are all sorts of other reasons, the well-known reasons why education matters for growth, social cohesion, for the other SDGs, and increasingly as we start to prepare for a world of artificial intelligence. I mean, these are important topics. Yet, and the reports that came out this week, to which Jack referred in his introduction, underline that. But we still face enormous challenges in the developing world. No absolute decline in the number of out-of-school children over the last decade. There has been a proportional decline, yes. No decline in the absolute number. The so-called global learning crisis is very well known. The fact that Africa is massively behind the rest of the world, and the fact that the financing available is so little compared to the sorts of estimates that are out there about what's needed. For instance, again, these reports that came out this week, I think they were talking about $29 billion gap. I mean, a gap that's larger than the aid currently available. So I was going to go through some slides about all of that, but I think most of you will be familiar with this, so I want to skip through those and just get to the point about the architecture. But just summarize again. There's learning is not what it should be. Education is key to the other SDGs. But I will pause on this one because it's part of my later argument. I would argue that the SDG 4 itself is creating some of the problems. That it has many, many positive things. It was put together in a very consultative way. That also may produce some negative things. It includes, obviously, a focus on learning. It includes early childhood. It includes equity. In fact, it includes absolutely everything, and that is the problem with it, in my view. And one can rightly criticize the former DFA goal or MDG goal for being inadequate. But I would say that we've now gone way too far the other way, such that it would not be much, that would be a slight exaggeration to say a country can basically do what it wants and claim that it is following the SDGs. I don't think that's quite fair, but it's something in that direction. Out of school children, progress stalled, as I mentioned. I don't have obviously the slides that came out, the stuff that came out this week. Global learning crisis. Important point for what I want to talk about. Serious lack of knowledge we still have. Yes, we still have an incredible lack of knowledge about what works. This is from 3IE, again, you probably can't read it, but this summarizes the evidence we have about what works in education. And it's not a lot. We don't know an awful lot. And most of what we know is about individual interventions. We don't know so much about how they are combined, despite all the talk about systems, approaches, and so on. Financing gaps, these are data from the Education Commission, which are probably now a bit out of date, but they're indicative of just the massive gaps which exist. Whoever estimates them, as I said earlier, the gaps are bigger than the current levels of aid. Not the current levels of spending, of course, the current levels of aid. And finally, most of the aid for education is not going to the low-income countries. It is going, much more to still something like 35% of aid is going to upper income countries and upper middle income countries, still. And before we come to the more complicated group of lower middle income countries, fast changing group. So what should be the functions of an international architecture? And I want to stress here that I don't want to just talk about financing. While the title of this talk has to do with aid, I believe that aid can be about many things as well as financing. And I think that, as far as I know, I'm not claiming vast originality, but I'm not sure anyone tried to write this down before. What are the attributes of an architecture? And I may well have got it wrong. But to me, there are 6 aspects of it. You could categorize it differently. Doesn't really matter. Leadership, advocacy on behalf of education. Setting of norms and standards. Lots of important international conventions and norms. Providing knowledge. I already mentioned how poor our knowledge is, but also providing knowledge support, getting what knowledge we do have, countries informed that they can use it. Monitoring, where we have a partial system. Accountability, where we have a lot of talk and not much in the way of any serious system of accountability. And finally, and not unimportant, of course, finance. I'm going to touch on some of these. Jack mentioned at the beginning, if anybody wanted a copy of the article, I can send that to you. Similarly, if you want a copy of these slides, I can send that to you because this contains some material not in the article, and it contains more detail than I'm going to, be able to discuss today. But basically, around leadership, it seems to me that, and I've already made this point, that the biggest problem has been actually the lack of leadership around SDG 4. But there have been other aspects of the lack of leadership. In the article, I talk also about the rather muted response to the way in which these so-called Abidjan principles are being used. Whether that was the intent of those who put them together doesn't really matter, but the way they're now being used to try to control or shut down non-state education in some countries is clearly an issue which there has been no significant leadership about among important figureheads in these type of agencies. Similarly, advocacy for education. As we know, this week there's this Ethiopia. So the first version of the draft conclusions or communique or whatever of that, despite the fact that education is one of the topics, did not contain a word about education. It was only when the Global Monetary Report people blew the whistle on this that it started containing some words. How did that even happen? But it happened. And so on. And the different agencies have, I don't want to go into detail now. We have, a lot of partial efficacy around advocacy. I'm not saying there isn't some. Of course there's some. But it seems to me there's not sufficient overall advocacy on behalf of education. The second point, the second aspect of the architecture I mentioned is the setting of norms and standards. People often don't think much about this, but actually it's one of the bits that I think are working reasonably well. UNESCO, for all its problems, and I'm going to come to them, has done a fairly good job around conventions around things like international recognition of qualifications, around a lot of the right to education work, not all of it, some of the Abidjan stuff, but a lot of it. So I think that this part has actually been working reasonably well. And maybe, the hypothesis, I can't prove it, maybe interestingly that's because that's been one area which nobody else has touched. It's been clearly handled by one agency and other people have accepted that. And it's done it fairly well. Knowledge. Well, I already mentioned the financial problems of UAS. Can you imagine, though, just think about the numbers. Does anybody know? Well, one or two people know, but does anyone know what the UIS annual budget is? $10 million. That is all. $10 million, and it's scrambling to get it. How can it be that either the UNESCO doesn't, even with all its own financial problems, doesn't put more resources into it? How can it be that others don't put more resources into it? We're here in Britain, so DFID actually used to put quite a bit in. Has stopped doing so, as I understand it. I may be wrong, in part because of the lack of burden sharing. Nobody else is putting in, so it reasonably says, well, why should we keep doing it so nobody else is going to do it? Anyway, statistics, inadequately funded. Research, a lot of good research going on, but insufficient, and also, not on the slide, but I think an important point, driven from the north, not driven from the south. Documenting what works, again, a lot of good things going on. I used that slide from CIE, lots of good things, but all very partial. No systematic way of assembling all this information. Innovation, various moves to promote innovation, but again, nothing very systematic. Joint learning, I would argue, is a massive need. Countries learning from each other, no very good systems for that. Technical support, big problem. Old ways of doing technical assistance clearly don't work. New ways haven't been well thought through or well implemented, and so on. I'm not going to go into great detail. Monitoring. So we have the global report, Education Monitoring Report, another very fragilely financed organization, but not doing, it's not supposed to, it's not doing a good job about individual country performance, or part of its mandate. So nobody's really looking at individual country performance. And even its own funding, well, it may have changed in the last few weeks, I'm not sure, but it certainly wasn't when I last talked to the director about a month ago, it wasn't even assured for this calendar year. There's a fairly good monitoring system for donors who are members of the DAC through OECD, but there's not much for multilaterals. Some people would argue that's not true. There are agencies like MOPAN and so on that are looking at the multilaterals. If you think that that's good, I invite you to take a look at the latest MOPAN report on UNESCO, which basically says it's doing a wonderful job, which seems very unlikely. Most of you probably might share that view. Nobody is monitoring this topic. We're discussing functioning of the architecture. We used to do that. I say we because I used to be the director of the monitoring board, but we used to do that, and now it's still in there, but it's very cautious, linked to the lack of finances. I think that the situation is very difficult for the current team because they're in a UNESCO that's very sensitive. They're at a UNESCO, which is very sensitive about criticism and so forth. It's quite a tricky situation. But most important, I think, is the lack of a accountability system. If we had a better accountability system, of course, we'd have to have better monitoring, then the accountability system would require it. But we haven't really got much around that. Within GPE, Global Partnership for Education, there's a lot of talk about mutual accountability, but in fact, it's not really very mutual in that the both countries, bilaterals and multilaterals, do not necessarily respond when they're criticized or held accountable for certain things. The most obvious example of that, which is linked to financing, being the fact that almost all these agencies adhere in principle to the Paris-Busan, etc. accords, which of course are wider than education, but don't actually adhere to them in practice. And so here we come then to finance. So I think there's several aspects of finance to discuss. One is the absolute level. We already talked about the financing gap. But the second has got to do, and it's a very important point, and one of the things we were able to get into I was also a bit involved with the Commission report, were able to get into that, the very low proportion of multilateral aid for education compared to many other sectors. I can't remember the numbers, but I think it's about 1/3 that is multilateral, whereas in some other sectors, health is about twice that. And so that's one important point, quite aside from the levels. And why is it important? Because I think there's a presumption, which I think is reasonable, that multilateral money is more likely to flow to the countries that are in greatest need. Not the case every time, but at least more than bilateral money, which inevitably, and it's not unreasonable, also has to meet certain political or bilateral foreign policy objectives. So there's that aspect. There's also this proposed international financing facility for education, which I guess is close to becoming a reality. But it's going to focus on the lower middle income countries and help them increase their borrowing for education. Is that really the priority? Gordon Brown would argue that it is, that it's when you make the transition from being a lower income country to being a lower middle income country that you actually need a lot more investment in education. But I think that I don't agree with that. I think that the problem is the insufficient resources going to the very poorest countries, in part because of the problems around this other topic I've already discussed of the technical support. They do not have, their systems are not ready to receive the sorts of money they actually need. So we need to crack these two together. There's a whole question of refugee and emergency finance. Now we have this new education cannot wait. Fine. So its amounts of money are quite small. And then we have this issue that global public goods are inadequately funded. And it's not just the UIS and the Global Monitoring Report, those are the two most easy examples to talk about. We'll also take a broader topic of research, take a broader topic of knowledge. And interestingly, the only agency which is currently trying to do something about this is GPE, which is setting up something called the Knowledge and okay. Well, maybe that's good, but why there? So, what final point I want to make is not about the different functions which the 6 functions I argued should be there. It's got to do with the representativeness. So these agencies, I believe, are still too much dominated by the rich countries. That is not necessarily a criticism of the rich countries, it's partly also a criticism, I think, of the major middle-income countries like India and China, which haven't yet really taken on a kind of global leadership role. But certainly, the very poorest countries don't have an adequate voice. And then the second thing, which is very interesting, is that despite the fact that globally something like 20% of education is non-state, with a few exceptions, such as the GP again, actually, non-state education doesn't have much of a voice in these fora. I'm not just talking about for-profit, but I mean all types of non-state education. And of course, in many countries, especially in Africa and in India, especially in urban parts of both of those, non-state education is very rapidly expanding. Now, there are quite a few initiatives going on. One of the riposts to what I've written has been people saying, well, you're not taking account of these things which are happening. And that's maybe partly reasonable, but I think partly not. So, following the Education Commission, there are now these small handful of so-called pioneer countries where some good things are happening. It's just a handful. There's this proposed IFED thing I've already mentioned on that. It's got a lot of creative things to it, but is basically, in my view, unnecessary. It would have been great to have some type of international financing facility along the lines of the one which exists for maternal and reproductive health, but more targeted, again, on the poorest countries, rather than on increasing borrowing by middle-income countries. Education cannot wait, I already mentioned, seems to me good in principle, but probably more money. This proposed education outcomes fund for Africa and the Middle East, again, seems to me a good idea in principle, but I think, I'm not privy to the latest discussions. I don't know if it's likely to be funded or not. When I last heard it, didn't seem to be going as well as perhaps been hoped, but I don't know if I'm not up to date on that. There have been quite a few discussions going on around the so-called education ecosystem, but it's not very clear to me whether or not the major agencies in the architecture are buying into those discussions, or whether it's more coming from a few philanthropies. And then the Education Commission itself missed an opportunity, in my view, to discuss these architecture issues. Not without some trying. Another guy and I actually wrote a paper for them about the architecture, which they had a lot of discussion about. But by the end, I think perhaps because the makeup of the commission itself included the heads of many of these agencies, either the executive head or the chair of the board equivalent. Anyway, for whatever reason, that topic was never really broached by the commission as a whole. You can argue that its focus was narrower and was on finance, and that's what we should have stuck to. Yes, but how the finance flows matters. So I would. So how did we get into this mess? I'm not going to go through all these points, but I think that a lot of it is linked, I'm afraid, to the decline of UNESCO through its increasing politicization. That's not the only problem. That's not the reason that the age is so low, that financing is so low. But that's a lot of it, I think. I mean, that 40 years ago, UNESCO was a pretty credible agency. Today, it's credible on a few things, as I mentioned, like norms and so on. And it pains me to say this as somebody who used to have a high-level job there. But it's very, it's relatively weak in technical work, which doesn't mean it doesn't have some good parts, let me stress. We've got, this is a whole mishmash of points, but it's basically trying to make the thing about the things that become too politicized in different ways. The governance structure of GPE, so if you were trying to design a perfect system, you might design something like it, except the poor chief executive can basically not move now without permission of the board. I mean, that's a job I think nobody would want to have. That's all right, seems to like it. But I think it would be just so difficult if you have to go back to the board for everything. There are very limited funds because there's so little available for things like global public goods. Everyone's a small amount of money. And those global public goods, I think they are around 2 to 3% of international funding. Health, it's about 22, 23%. I don't think it should be at the health level because the health includes money for scientific research, vaccines, things like that. But it should be clearly a lot more than the current 2 or 3%. I would guess 12% or something like that. I don't know exactly, but something of that order of magnitude. And then the result is that a lot of these agencies, including one whose board I chair, IIEP, are having to seek to do things more on a consultancy basis rather than on a need basis. Are we on track? So basically, I think there are too many agencies and insufficiently coordinated. Now, recently there have been some moves to have some discussions about those agencies. There was one discussion in Paris last week, I understand. But still, I don't think there's a lot happening there, but I might be wrong. I'm not part of any of this anymore. Basically, to summarize what I think the problem is, we don't have a global system with the capacity to help improve national systems, especially for low-income countries. I won't go into any more detail on that. Similarly, I'm not going to go into detail because of time, but I think we can learn from the health sector. A lot of people have thought about that. I think we can learn from the sector which maybe not so many people have thought about. Some very interesting things which have been happening in the broader economics, macroeconomics finance area. So we have a lot of technical centers and similar, driven by the IMF and the World Bank, doing a very good job actually of helping countries strengthen their economic and financial management. We have other things going on in other sectors, which I won't go into. We have some things we could learn from the past, not to be nostalgic, but when the World Bank, it's only 50 years since the World Bank was started lending for education, some 20 years after the bank itself started. And it began in a very close cooperation with UNESCO in a very effective way. UNESCO was providing the technical support, and the bank was providing the money and the financial stuff. We can learn from that, I think. Basically, it began to decline when various policy differences came to the fore, and neither institution's management chose to address those issues, but rather let the collaboration go away, which is a pity, I think. And of course, more recently, UNESCO has been much further weakened by the withdrawal, initially the withdrawal of financing, and now the actual withdrawal of the US
Thanks very much, Nick. And I don't know why we're sitting opposite each other, because pretty much a lot of what he said, I think a lot of us around the room with support, and really excellent, an excellent paper which I've read and really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you to CGD also for setting this up. So I'm head of profession for education at DFID, and prior to this discussion I did consult with our advisors, so you've got 40 for the price of one today. So some of the reflections I'm going to provide are very much from their perspective at country level, which is what my remit was. I also currently sit as the chair for the Grants Performance Committee for GPE, so I'll just be bringing in some reflection from that role as well. But as I say, I'm not going to speak very long, so I'd rather answer questions and respond, and let's have a proper discussion. So I'll only be a few moments. I mean, as I said, Nick, I think broadly most of what you said, you know, I and we as DFID would probably agreement with. I mean, I think I suppose in nuance, I would say, I think you say there that we don't know what works, and I actually think I sort of challenge that a little bit. I think that certainly we've in DFID we've had a process over the last 12 months of producing a set of best buys papers, which has had a stab at looking at global evidence and looking at I mean, it's got a very cost-effective sort of lens. But you know, what if we've got a limited amount of funds? What should we be investing in? And you know, it's a process. It's not complete. It's not finalised. And certainly we're working. We've actually been in dialogue with the bank and others to start this process going. But I think we do. There's a lot of things we know. We know that effective teaching matters. We know that robust data matters. We know we need to get more information and data on the most marginalised, because those statistics have stagnated, whereas aggregately countries have improved in certain areas. We know that going to scale matters. We know that going to scale based on sort of country knowledge and experience is the best way forward. I think the frustration, teaching at the right level, I can give you a list, but I think we do know actually lots of things, and I think the challenge is that's not being, as you rightly pointed out, linked with the international system and delivery. And I think, you know, within my experience of GP, I think there's an honest, you know, recognition of that, you know, at the moment the structure there is as a technical team and then a financial country lead team. And for the best will in the world, no one person is going to be an expert. But there at the moment, we need to get those systems better to make sure that when finance does flow, and a significant amount of finance is flowing to Africa through the GPE, and particularly, I'm pleased to say, to the Sahelian region, which is some of the worst statistics in the world. But as you rightly say, without that sort of input of technical understanding and expertise and focusing the design on what we know matters, there is a risk that won't have so much impact. So I think I just wanted to share that, and it'd be good to get other people's views on that. I mean, just following up from the points that you've made, maybe specifically on GPE, Nick, as well. I mean, as you know, there has been a process of recognition on what they call the Effective Partnerships Review. Some of you might be aware of that. And that was sort of under the remit of my committee. As all these things, I know this is recorded, as typically GPE, it all turned out to be quite a long process. And as you rightly say, we had to have a lot of dialogue and consensus building, but we are at the point of rolling that out. And I think I am confident some of these issues of you know, choosing grant agents that just fit with projects, but having that choice coming after, for example, the concept of the programme, I think that will make a difference, I think, to ensure that money is targeted in the right place. There's a lot of work going on transaction costs at country level, and all my advisors have come back and said that is a key problem. There's a whole set of processes with GPE, and now we have ECW, and potentially now IFID, and potentially, if you're Ghana, the Education Outcomes Fund as well. And all of these have very separate processes. So I think linked with that, for us, for the country level people that have come back to me, leadership is important, yes, but what they care about is coordination. And actually getting our act together at country level much more. So I think if we can't do it at international level, you can imagine how much worse it is when we come down to country. So when we do have this global discussion, which we're very much part of, Nick, that you're calling for, I think let's not get it all right up here and not make sure that doesn't actually translate at country level, because the fragmentation has grown, as you say. So I think individual agencies like GPE, ECW need to get their process and transaction costs better. It's no good them just doing it within their own structures. They need to be coordinating with others. And I guess that's my final point on education and emergencies, just to support, a positive step. And obviously DFID was behind, the setting up of ECW was very actively involved, as well as Joseph, obviously, and others. I think we need to celebrate some of the positives. So certainly, for example, the response to the Syria crisis. I mean, there was a huge moment there when agencies came together. We can do it, and there was a joint results framework, a joint support to the programme, and so it started off really, really well. Now, my understanding, and I haven't visited that recently, but I was speaking to the advisor who worked there. Since then, there has been more fragmentation, and it seems another challenge I'd like to throw in is that when we shift from this sort of humanitarian big attention response, we move into the development zone, and then all the politics come back again, and it becomes more difficult. So we need to get that bit right, not providing any answers, but I think we do need to celebrate when it does work as well as when it doesn't, and learn from when it does work. But I think, but in terms of specifically GPE and ECW, I think we collectively, and DFID would be supporting that, we really need to work together with these two organisations, and whether it's a memorandum of understanding, I think coming back to your final slide, Nick, of what's possible, let's do the art of the possible, not the art of the impossible. I think right now we could actually really sort of make sure that at least those two initiatives are working closely, because they are working together in a number of different countries now, and that's the reality. Okay, if they set off together, we could have had a clear division of labour, but at the moment, that's where we are. They're not going to, GP is suddenly not going to stop all its grants in Chad and all these other places, but we certainly need to be pushing that. And I know from DFID's perspective, we will be, pushing and influencing that. But I just, I think to call for others, I think we all should try and be on the same page. Many of us sit on the same boards of both organisations, so I think we need to be pushing for that. There's a lot more I could say, but I would rather, pass over to Joe, because I know you've got some really interesting things to say on accountability. But then, of course, let's have a dialogue, and I'll be very open to answer specific questions on any of anything I've said, and obviously anything related that Nick has covered. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sally.
Great, thanks, Jack. And just to acknowledge CGD's convenership of this meeting, I think it's absolutely terrific and great that we're having it. And I genuinely believe that there is a growing momentum around this question and a lot of interest. And so I think we are poised potentially to make some breakthroughs if we particularly if we can generate a consensus around some of these issues. Maybe just for a little bit of background, but also I think for some transparency, I'll just say where I might be coming from, some of the experience. I did spend 7 years on the GPE board, 4 of which was as chair of the Strategy and Policy Committee, where a lot of things we talked about kind of, in part emerged. As Sally said, Help Design Education Cannot Wait, and now sit on its board and chair something called the Global Book Alliance, which is another multi-stakeholder partnership, which, surprise, surprise, includes DFID and Norway and the US and the World Bank and the UNESCO and UNICEF, amongst others, right? So that's that. And then also on the UNESCO question, again, just for transparency, last year I was appointed by the then Secretary of State to the UK National Commission with the education portfolio. And I'm supposed to be advising DFID and helping them engage with UNESCO. And very much, and I was very honest about this, doing that job with a reform kind of approach, because I think, it needs it. So one set of quick observations around financing, and then a couple more. So just in respect to the financing piece, I genuinely think coherence is critical, but the concern and respect that we have, particularly around the emergence of new financing mechanisms with respect to fragmentation, is overstated. The biggest form of fragmentation in the aid sector is bilaterals, right? I mean, that's where the transaction costs come from countries. And in contrast to health, although of course they have many more multilateral mechanisms than in education, there is in fact greater coherence because of the increased share that Nick referred to of aid that goes through multilateral mechanisms where a greater consensus is reached and where countries know what's in the pipeline and where it's coming. So it's not to say, as Sally absolutely correctly set out, that we need to work out what the relationships across these entities are, and I would add there the biggest player in the room, which we haven't hitherto mentioned, which is the bank. That is absolutely critical, but that is not the principal concern in respect of the question of fragmentation. And in fact, more multilateralism in education would be better for everyone, in my humble opinion. That's not to say that there's not work to do, and I will come to that in a second. I think critically in education, and this is just, the contrast is actually on every single front. But the first point I would say is we need a better picture of funding, not just the international funding, but the domestic funding. So in respect to national health accounts, there are almost 100 national health accounts, right? And there is, of course, the Global Health Expenditure Database that the World Health Organization runs, etc. And at any point, you can tell pretty confidently what a government's spending on health and its subsectors. That is not available for education, right? So there are about 20 national education accounts that are current. So again, global public good, we are just not investing in that, and we need a bit of picture, right? And that contributes to, it's not the principle only, that contributes to a lack of data. That is not just exclusive to the domestic side, of course. We have very poor tracking of education funding on the international side, education aid, and if you thought it was bad there, it's even worse on the humanitarian front, right? And we absolutely need to lean in and have better and ideally real-time data on all of these things and much better classifications of what's spent and on what sectors. In respect of education aid, at least, I think we also need more focus. So, who knows who the biggest donor is to education? Germany. But, none of us, at least in respect of the basic education field, have Germany in our sights, right? Because the vast majority of its aid is spent on tertiary education and TVET. Now, I'm not here to possibly case against Germany, and in fact, our civil society colleagues there have done a valiant job in moving Germany more to support basic education, with a big contribution to the Global Partnership of Education via its replenishment, and contributions over the last 3 years to Education Cannot Wait, and we anticipate an increase in that this year. Great. But my point was, and this really picks up Nick's point, I think that we're run the risk of SDG 4 meaning everything to everyone and being too diffuse. And although there are definitely improvements with respect to that framework, there are challenges. And when we had an MDG which was more focused, you could enter the room and at least you knew what everyone was committing to, whether or not it was going to be delivered. So I think I would say we're not going to be able to achieve this overall, but a coalition of the willing that in respect of international support for education, focus more on the basics and more on the countries that are furthest behind, that would be welcome. Bear in mind that we're talking about SDG 4 and all of the indicators which we're supposed to be achieving, and today, more than 50% of children in low-income countries won't complete primary school. So with that stark reality that we're so far away from the MDG which we committed to almost 20 years ago, I just think we have to have an element of reality around what needs to be prioritised. Just on all of this, some of you, and I know because some of you talked to me about it, we discussed my suggestion, which emerged at a time when GP was talking about a particular fix for some of these issues in the form of its family of funds idea, which is now, I'm correct in saying, doesn't really have legs. A kind of a middle way that I suggested, which was that at least the international education financing architecture could come together at the level of its principles and agree to a global education financing forum. The work of which would need to be built out, but it would certainly include a commitment to getting better real-time data on all of these pieces, amongst other things. I'm delighted to say that at the UNESCO meeting last week, the people in the room, led by a proposal from the Special Envoy for Education, Gordon Brown, committed to that. So we now have a new piece of the architecture in the form of a global forum. Now, of course, we need to know what the detail is, but if you want to look at the commitment to that, it's in the Director General's statement as a result of that meeting that's published on the UNESCO website. So, I think in response to ways forward, we are able to coalesce and agree on certain things, and we obviously now have to build that out to make sure that it's absolutely right and proper, but it's a start. Sally called for an MOU between these two of the funders in the form of GPE and ECW. That has also been agreed. It was agreed at the ECW XCOM in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, as has shared board membership. GP is already on the ECW board, but that will now be reciprocated, which is fantastic. So on the financing front, there's huge amounts more work to do, but I think there's some of the issues and some of the progress. I think more generally, and I'll finish in a moment, I was not surprised, as Jack sort of said, none of us probably were, with the assessments which UIS and the Global Education Monitoring Report produced this week, which were all pretty dire in respect to how far off track we are in achieving SDG 4, right? What I was surprised at, and frankly appalled at, was the lack of reaction to it, and the lack of a plan to get us back on track. Gobsmacked. And the failure of any urgency and any consensus that we could do this. And even the suggestion that I heard from the HLPF events yesterday from some that, it's not going to be feasible to fund SDG 4, and so almost a resignation to failure. So that's what I was most surprised at. And, if we, again, I don't want to be too comparative with our colleagues in health, but, I do sit there with some envy, and I worked in health before I worked in education, so that on every single front, on political will, on planning, on financing, and on delivery, they outpace us. We're asking for £75 million from DFID over the next 3 years for education cannot wait, right? Civil society. And we've been told that's an ambitious ask and will be a real stretch. Fine, I understand that. But at the same time, the Prime Minister fantastically announced 1.4 billion for the Global Fund, right? For the same operating period, 400 million a year, And I said to Alicia Herbert this week, how do we get there? What do we do to do that? And I think that's the challenge. So in respect of the HLPF this week, my calls are for a plan. Health has one. All of the vertical funds came together last year and developed the Global Health Action Plan, driven in part by Angela Merkel's call and the Prime Minister of Botswana and others to consolidate. And we absolutely need one in education. It beggars belief that we have a goal, but we don't have a plan about how to achieve it. But what's more, which the UIS report this week set out, we don't even know the starting point because we're not collecting the data, right? So there's this huge, big global public good gap in the form of investment in collecting the data, which needs to be addressed. I would say, and this isn't a prerequisite of the plan, but I would say, great if the plan could agree some priorities. And for me, some of those priorities would be addressing the SDG 4 indicators that refer to basic education and pre-primary, and prioritise the countries who are furthest behind. Not just actually in Africa, but there are pockets elsewhere, of course, in South Asia as well. So I would say that's really key. But you know what? Even if we didn't achieve that and we had a plan, that would be a good thing. The next thing, this is my 3-point call, is we actually then need an operational and accountability framework. So the other big contrast in this, which we referred to, is in health, there's clear mandates and capacity to deliver. So in respect of the plan, in respect of data, in respect of health education, national health accounts, etc., World Health Organization isn't just in the driving seat and everyone agrees that it needs to happen. It's got the money and the capacity and the wherewithal to make it so. So when they develop a plan and then they realise that the plan has to be implemented, they do have the technical systems that they can deploy with other partners to help the country work out how it's going to develop a plan that aligns. And I think that's really key. Accountability is also vital. And the final thing I would say, and again, it's their surfeit of riches over in the health side, at UNGA this year in September, our health colleagues had, wait for it, the high-level meeting on universal healthcare, right? It's a state-sponsored high-level meeting, not one of the ones that, I kind of pulled together with colleagues, but it has state sponsorship, it has a framework, and everyone's crowding in around it. It has a secretariat. And so, again, to deliver that big framework which docks into the plan. So my call is to say, between now and then, can we get a state-sponsored high-level meeting at next year's UNGA, at which this plan and the operational framework is endorsed and launched, which would be the launch of a decade of delivery on education, because we've got 10 years left to 2030, and we're not going to get, we're not going to achieve all of the indicators, but how much further forward can we get? Rather than many decades, in some, almost 100 years' time, how much closer to 2030 can we get in respect to some of the key ones? And I think that's the opportunity. and the challenge. But I also feel like there's growing awareness that this is the challenge, and that, with the right support, and I think as much as possible, a shared understanding of the problem and a consensus amongst us about what can be done about it. And I'm not suggesting it needs to be my 3-point plan, but along the lines of that, it's simple, it's understandable, that can crowd people in, we can do it.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and thank you to Sally and Joseph for their comments. Okay, we've got just over 20 minutes now remaining, so I will open it to the floor for questions. We'll take about 3 questions at a time, and to anyone if you want to put it all to the group, and we'll proceed from there. And can you just introduce yourself before asking your question, please?
So I'm David Archer from Action Aid. I think this is a really crucially important topic. Getting greater global coordination between what I think is a fragmentation of efforts is a real priority. I think the GPE has been designed and conceived in line with the sort of Paris and Busan aid effectiveness principles as a way to go, but that's the place around which things could converge. But even if we got billions, tens of billions more money in a globally coordinated aid, that is peanuts. Because the real challenge is the domestic financing. And the big problem, and I think I always get a bit worried about the sort of inadequacy that the education people feel relative to health. Because there is a big problem with a lot of the global health financing, but displacing domestic financing, replacing long-term predictable domestic financing with short-term unpredictable and conditioned aid. And the real win is to leverage greater domestic financing by developing countries themselves. GPE has started down that line by making it a requirement to maintain or increase your domestic in order to access GP funds, but there's a lot more that could be done in that area. And it seems to me that there is a need for greater global coordination, but the real challenge is to make sure that that coordination helps to leverage better domestic commitment, deeper domestic commitment, and respects the sovereignty of countries, provides support, but doesn't try to impose a set of conditions and ideologies on those countries. I think we need to go back. The danger of a greater coordination and global weight is that sometimes that can be overpowering and countries end up losing control of their own education system. I think that's a real problem. So yes to global coordination in order to minimize transaction costs and in order to better leverage domestic financing, which would be different. So I would like to reframe that debate about how do we make that connection rather than just think that global coordination themselves will do it.
Thank you. David? Please.
Can I echo that? I think domestic funding is critical for sustainability. Nick referred to this in terms of the amount of domestic funding that's currently done by parents, particularly at the early years, preschool level, paying for the education of their children. And so I just think in terms of a colonial model of state monopoly provision, which is what we've hitherto kind of encouraged in low-income countries, kind of leveraging off that local commitment and domestic financing commitment by parents seems to me to be an opportunity to not only address the financing thing, but also the accountability issue. But it needs strengthening by measurement and evaluation, because that's often lacking. So I'm just interested in what Nick might want and other people might want to say about the role of that local domestic rental financing in achieving SDG 4.
I'm sorry, your name, Peter.
Oh, I'm sorry, Peter Hinton. Apologies.
Yeah, Andrew Rogerson, I'm a visiting fellow here and at CGD, and I also authored the paper to which I think Nick elliptically referred to, proposing a global financing facility for education, which would be the analogue of the one for maternal and child health. You can find it in the Commission background papers. And quite interesting to understand a little bit about why that didn't come about and the separate solution was followed. And I think it was the failure to find a division of labour between the World Bank and GPE that would work. And I think that problem is still there, latent. We can try to dance around it. We can talk about plans for different places to meet. By the way, that was also very much focused on leveraging national funding in the way that GFF for health is. So I think we're constantly, I hear reruns of discussions even when I was at DFID 10 years ago between health and education, that somehow we need a plan, we need more money, and we need the right institutions to deliver. And I'm just trying to see where at the moment the priority is, because plans have been drawn up. They haven't been, the Global Commission for Education, among others, they haven't been implemented. There is dissatisfaction with some of the tensions between some of the players internationally as you rightly said, nationally. And it's a sort of, how do you break out of this inertia that would, a reinvigorated starting point of this high enough powered planning forum to leadership mechanism? Would that be the tipping point? Or would a pile of money sitting somehow driving incentives? I tend to think probably not, and like Fed and so on, change it. But we're sort of in danger of saying we need everything. We need public goods, we need better statistics, we need more coordinated, joined up country action, and we need better international institutions. And we've had this discussion quite a bit. So it's a question of what could be a definitive sort of tilt. And I think the nexus, unfortunately or fortunately, between the global partnership and the World Bank is probably neuralgic in that. If you can't work around or within that, then you probably won't achieve a tremendous amount more. You may get more people rallying to the cause in other ways, which is important.
So we've got 3 questions and comments, I suppose. One around whether or not this movement should focus and prioritise a little bit more on domestic resource mobilisation. Another in relation to what to prioritise, what might be the tipping point that starts to shift this. And Peter's question around the role of parents and domestic accountability. Does anyone fancy on top?
We've done some of it. So I think the point about domestic financing is absolutely right. Definitely I should have said more about that. Point 1. Point 2, I don't know why this is always put in the context of GPE. I think it's perhaps because GPE managed to implicate everybody, as we just heard. We're all involved somehow. I'm part of the external evaluation GP. These guys are on the committees, he's on the committee, and so on. And so it's a very interesting thing. But GPE is, without discussing its merits, is small. It's not big. It's not a lot of money. I don't know the latest, but I don't think they're yet dispersing $1 billion a year. I'm not quite sure about it. Not getting up there, but not even at that level. Secondly, indeed, GP and maybe others like the bank, though less in an overall way, have indeed been focusing on greater domestic commitments. But as I just mentioned, I'm part of the external evaluation of the country level evaluations of GP, and I don't want to be quoting this because it isn't right, or because I can't remember the numbers. I think it's only 2 or possibly 3 of the countries that have so far been evaluated in which there has actually been an increase in spending. There have been many in which, again, I can't remember the numbers, I'm sorry, but there are many in which there's been a commitment, but when we look at the actual spending, it hasn't happened. And this then reminds me of a very important discussion we actually had in preparation for the mission with various people, including the person many of you may know, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who used to be the finance minister of Nigeria. And she said, and I've always remembered this, she said, when I was finance minister, of course, all the different ministries come and ask me for more. It's normal. But there was only one ministry which couldn't tell me what it would do with the money or what results it would achieve. And you can guess which one that was. And Ngozi then also had another very interesting experience. She actually cut the education budget, and the results improved. So you know, it's not
by much. No.
maybe, anyway. But and I'm not arguing that there should be cuts. But I do think that it's not just where I'm trying to go with this. It's not just the level of the domestic spending; it's what it's spent on and how it's spent. To be fair, one of the reasons the health maybe has finds things a bit easier because 35% of something of health spending is on stuff, not on people, drugs and so on. It's a little bit easier there to move money. But I do think that we need to spend as much time on the composition of the domestic spending as on its level. And that would, I think, be a very important thing that maybe is insufficiently handled by such agencies as GPE, with their focus on the commitment rather than what it's used for. I'll let someone else talk about the other point.
Just to follow on from that, and thanks for very useful questions. No, I mean, I think that's certainly, you know, just in terms of the committee that I've been chairing and looking at this question again and again and again about the amount. And I think there's two things. I think first, you know, completely agreed, you know, on, you know, the sustainability and the importance of domestic commitment. And I mean, the challenge is there are places where even, you know, that even if they met, you know, the proportion, I mean, it's not going to be enough, you know. So, I mean, there's going to be need for other, I mean, so I think realistically, that's not going to solve all the problems. So we've got to have both, right? You're right, David, you always have done to keep us from reminding everybody about this. But I think just in terms of looking forward, I think there is definitely a recognition that a sort of percentage isn't, you know, it's very crude in terms of what it actually, and also that incentive, you know, does it really incentivise that sort of commitment and what? So I think that will be looked at. So again, all of those of you here that are involved in GPE, there's going to be a lot of consultation around looking at the new strategy. That's people's opportunity to feed in about some of these sort of, you know, critical issues about what are the incentives that, I mean, it's not a lot of money, Nick. I don't know what world you live in, but I mean, it's still quite a lot. So I still think it's important that we spend it well. I just wanted to follow up on Joseph's point, because I do think, you know, I'm representing the bilateral, but I agree. You know, as a technical person, you know, and I think, and actually I was surprised we weren't included in your paper, Nick, actually. I wasn't offended or anything, but we weren't included in your paper. But because you're right, since swaps, you know, whatever the reasons for the pros and cons against sector budget support, we shifted, we're in a completely different world. And in a way, that's where GPE has come into its own, because it's probably the only, you know, it's the only organisation in the block who's saying, actually, it's important we coordinate, it's important we're on plan, it's important we do this. And actually, all of us donors have shifted in terms of our modalities. And I think you're right to challenge us on that. And I think we ought to be not just sort of looking out there at the multilaterals, but we should be looking at ourselves. I think there is some discussion about, you know, how we do business at the moment, but you know, I can't really say very much more on that on camera. So I can't give, because this is quite a political discussion. But I think we are part of the problem. I recognise that.
The value of difference contribution there is it generally brings pretty large amounts of money. Plenty of donors around the world who do that.
Yeah.
But say here's 500, here's 200, here, you know, I see it all the time. You know? So anyway, that's the issue. Can I just come in?
Yeah.
So just quickly, so I want to answer Andrew's point, but it's also related to Nick's observation. And Nick says, so I don't quite know why we all focus on GPE. You know, we have. It's only a small part of the picture, and I'll tell you why. Because the most functional part of the architecture. It's there. You can see what it does. Everyone, it has the widest constituency. It has developing countries, civil society, donors, all of the multilaterals. Problem, of course, and I've seen it and I can continue to see it. Everyone looks to it because it is that and says solve the problem. So you said, I don't know why GP is investing in KICS, knowledge information exchange, big contribution to global public goods. Fair point, but it's because no one else is. I mean, I think there is a really strong case for it and a theory of change behind it. So I think that's fair. But nevertheless, no one else is, right? So that is, therein lies our big problem. It's not the problem that GPE has, although GPE is constantly put in the frame for things it ought not to, and it causes lots of transaction costs and undermines its mandate, right? Because people say, oh, you can do this, and other people around the table who might think they should do it, or others, including the bank in respect to some things, but not principally, say no, shouldn't. And then they spend, a couple of board meetings working out what the exact language is in respect to what the demarcation dispute should be, right? So that is absolutely the case. And it's only, at one level is a financing mechanism, coordinating mechanism to some extent with respect to education sector. So that's okay. You've observed what the issue is there. Why is that the case? Well, unfortunately, we have to look at the other part of the architecture, which was UNESCO, right? So for better or worse, it does have this mandate for education coordination, right? And performs the same role that other entities do for other SDGs, right? For the education SDGs. So, that is that. But everyone knows that it is not doing that well, that it is also equally not supported to do it, and certainly not funded, right? Now, that's fine. So we could all argue for more funding and support for UNESCO to do it, but the catch-22 is it has lost the confidence of lots of stakeholders, right? Because it is largely, in many ways, a dysfunctional institution, and there is no appetite amongst the donors that I know, including some that I'm closest to and talk to regularly, to invest in UNESCO. And you know what? The UK supports UNESCO to an extent, but the vast majority of its funding, which is very modest, is conditioned and specific to the Global Education Monitoring Report, to UIS, etc. So the idea of unrestricted funding, like the World Health Organization gets to perform all of its global public goods and perform its leadership role, just isn't on the table, and I can't see that moving. So that is one of our challenges. I'm speaking very plainly, but that is the thing. It's not just an issue for the UK; it's an issue for everyone. And the question is, how do we move out of that, right? And until we do, people will look to GP, because I said it's the most functional thing. They'll kind of, lean in around that, expect it to do things which it's not empowered to do, and then it will get pulled up, both by its governance, I mean the mechanisms, but also the board, but also its relationships with others, like the banks. So, that is actually our problem. If you nail that, that's the fundamental issue, which is no clarity, some clarity of responsibility, but no willingness to allow the responsibility to be exercised or to support the institution to perform that role.
Right, 5 more minutes. Lee.
I don't think we've had a huge amount of discussion about UNICEF and what their role should be. And just coming from the last year, I've been living in Rwanda, and there, UNICEF is a real international organisation that has presence on the ground. GP have consultants who fly in and out. The World Bank have their TCLs who live in Washington. The presence of the international community is the big bilateral donors, USAID and DFID, and UNICEF, co-chair the working group. And I think that's similar in other countries in Africa that I've worked in, that they are there and they have a mandate to work with ministries of education and to provide technical assistance. I'm not sure they are as effective always as they could be, given that they have that fairly unique role in country as an organisation that has this mandate and staff, it has money, it has presence.
Hi, Desmond Birmingham, currently the Chief Executive of Australian Council for Education Research. One of the few organisations that works across the developing world, and it's actually brought different perspectives to me in working on this. I'm going to throw a challenge question to you, three of you, which is not from ACR, it's from me personally. I mean, like Andrew, many of these conversations feel very familiar to me, and I was involved in them 10 years ago. The world has changed in some really important ways in the past 10 years, hasn't it? And I just wonder your reflections on the two big changes that strike me, and the growth of populist, nationalist, anti-globalist leadership in the US, also here in the UK with the Brexit Party and others, and some of those political movements are explicitly anti-aid. What might that mean for aid? And the second big one that I think we're all conscious of, but perhaps don't face very often, is we're beginning to see the impact of global warming on the massive migration patterns across the world. 250 million people displaced in the last 10 years. That's going to only increase in the next 10 years. Those, for me, feel like sea changes that perhaps we ignore at our peril if we talk about just what's going on in the education sector. I know it's a challenging question, but I welcome reflections from many of you on that.
Yes, please.
I'm Melissa from UNICEF UK. Thank you all so much. It's a really interesting presentation. I guess, and forgive me for not really knowing how to frame this, but I'm interested in to what extent we recognise that there are issues that are not education issues, but are, as David highlights, kind of taxation-based issues, funding issues that are system strengthening outside of education system strengthening, and to what extent do we invite those people into the conversation? So, Nick points out that there's lots of learning to be had from the financial and economic sectors, and to what extent would it be useful to not only learn from those sectors, but have them be part of the conversation?
Last question.
Quick, Edward Independent. A couple of reflections. One on the, I suppose, given that so many people have some affiliation or some funding or some influence over GPE a little bit, when I heard it, the point about education ministry capacity made again last week by someone saying, why is it in so many countries the education ministry is among the weakest of the ministries? And then it seems to me that one thing that hasn't changed is this rather sort of original type sort of Paris Declaration style of mandate the GPE has, getting behind country systems. And yet the majority of funding through the grant agencies is not through country systems, and there are precious few incentives to do that. Now that is a reality, of course, of the changed donor political economy in Bristol, but there seems to me some need to have a more honest, frank conversation about whether that proposition is still realistic, and if that theory of change about how you strengthen the sort of sector implementation capacity, which is probably more problem sector planning capacity, then, well, what's in its place if that is no longer the thing? Or is there something that those are willing to do to adjust the responses of grant agents or to put more pressure in the conditions of the GP board? The second thing that seems to be an observation sort of curiously absent is, probably one of Joseph's points, is the idea of a big new forum on global advocacy and strategic questions. Absolutely, absolutely great. A more modest complementary contribution is that there's a lot of noisy discussion about the failures of the multilateral system. There are precious few opportunities where the multilateral principals get together and have good quality dialogue about what things they could do collectively, what the collective comparative advantage is. One of those was last week. Starting with common purpose and sort of resolutely focusing on that, and even just bringing together that regularity of dialogue, which might have sort of modest contributions of alignment or how HQ incentives can flow down to country level coordination and these things would be a modest contribution to something that's missing, and contrast with health, an independent broker that brings that together. So it's rather reliant upon those principles to behave in unself-interested ways to try and advance opportunities. So in the absence of an independent broker, that's going to require quite a lot of pressure from the funders, the principals, the governing agents of those, to have this conversation and be quite concrete. May not be groundbreaking, but what in the next 6 months can be collectively achieved that will make some small contribution to X, and that could, in my personal opinion, what if that were to hold constant current funding levels and current architecture, and not put those bits, I think, just with current architecture and with current funding, what could be specifically improved in the next 6 months would be kind of reflections or questions, reactions to that.
Thank you, Ed. So there's this question on approach perhaps that we take to start to make movements. Lee's question on UNICEF, and I suppose the special position that it's in, whether it's being utilised correctly, taking advantage of that position, whatever the right phrase is. And then from UNICEF, question on whether we need to get others into the conversation. And finally, the biggest probably question of all, about how we expand this into questions of climate change, populist political movement. And we're very tight on time, so if you don't feel obliged to respond.
That's all right.
Okay. Please do that.
Okay, so let me focus on Anna's point and some of Desmond's point. I think there's a link, actually. So yes, of course, we should be looking at also at the whole question of revenue generation in these countries, because clearly more is needed for education. But it's not. But for the countries that are of most concern, at least to me, the very poorest countries, that's not going to do it. So let's take Niger. Niger already spending 4% GDP on education. Just to get, if you do the calculations, just to get everybody into primary and lower secondary would take 9% of GDP. Now, don't tell me that any country is going to spend 9% of GDP on education, at least from domestic resources. So this is a clear case where we need international resources. And it's also then linked to this point that second point Desmond made about migration. I mean, this is the sort of place from which the migrants are coming. And if people want to slow those movements, then we need to think very much about this, and you know, maybe not just from the human rights point of view, but from whatever sort of political point of view Western Europe or European countries may have concerns. So that I think this is I also say this to illustrate my point, because suppose we could internationally get the resources for Niger that it needs. It couldn't absorb them. It comes back to this point about the technical strength of the system. But we could get that. We could work with the Niger authorities to get it into such shape that within, I don't know, I'll make something up, 3 years, it could absorb at least twice what it currently takes. Something like that, I think, is feasible. But nobody is really working on this. That's my real point, that we need to get this technical stuff in as well as the money. Not necessarily together, by the way. There's a lot of evidence that putting them together may not work, but it may or may not. But to get it in. So let me. I must say something about UNICEF. Obviously, I think UNICEF is very, very interesting. Really quite effective in many cases at the country level, as you were implying. But it doesn't seem to be, currently at least, raising its voice much in terms of global advocacy. I mean, it says all the right things, but it doesn't seem to be sort of pushing very hard on these things in terms of interaction with other agencies. At least that's my impression.
I just come in very. I agree with those points. I think you're absolutely right in terms of. I think what you were nicely saying is that we're all a bit parochial in education, which we are, and I think it's important we do it within DFID. We're trying to do that much more, and I think it's. I just had just on a personal note. I worked in climate and environment. I knew absolutely nothing about climate and environment for about 3 years, and it really helped me come back to education. And the more that we all work across sectors, I think is a good thing. And so I think your point is well made. just on the big picture stuff. Obviously in terms of the sort of global warming and the movement of people and. I think what I think we tend to forget actually is some of the poorest countries in the world are taking in refugees and very, very generously actually. So and I think that point is often forgotten. In terms of the response to it, I think again it's the obvious things that we all say. That ability to be flexible, and I think again come back to GB, they have shown flexibility in grants and moved outside their comfort zone and enabled money to go as donors in education. We need to get better at understanding how to respond to the needs of refugees, and we've obviously built a lot of learning now through the Syria crisis. So I think, but it's not just about refugees. I get that, and I think, as you'll have seen, in terms of DFID again, that we've had a massive, struggle at the moment. We've got a Secretary of State who's incredibly strong and committed to the climate, and all of us across this piece are going to be mainstreaming that. So we're doing a piece of work at the moment in DFID to look at that and what that means for education programming in a really practical way. So we're doing that. On the populism, I just fear, my last point is that Nick gave this point about what happened with UNESCO and the politicisation, and I guess there's a risk that that's going to embed itself within the aid sector, and all of us, particularly donor organisations, will be impacted by that. So that what can I say? There's no answer, but it's a huge risk going forward, I guess. Joseph.
Great. So we're getting going. This is fantastic. Okay. So couldn't agree more on Niger and the wider Sahel, right? Like, it's a perfect illustration of this challenge, but is completely neglected, right? So we had an attempt to rectify that last week because, much to their credit, France at the G7 launched an initiative to support the Sahel. And they called the Elysee for the G7 countries to double their aid to basic education across the region, right? Now, for some, including the UK, Italy, and Germany, that would have been going from nothing to nothing, right? Literally. So we had to work out a formula by which that doubling could happen without giving any money. It failed. Okay. It did not get through. The Elysee continues to support that, but it is a classic example of a collective action failure. Right? The countries furthest behind on education, who will never be able to address the issue themselves, there wasn't any money in the pot, right? So we've got a long way to go, and I would implore us to think about how we can move the needle in support of the Sahel. I think on UNICEF, the issue I would just say at the global level in respect to UNICEF is one of the challenges there, of course, is even if they wanted to do more in this area, including perform some of the functions that Nick enumerated, like the normative ones, the leadership ones, etc., they do so as a UN agency in partnership with their UN peers, right? And I know that when they rub up against each other, there are issues, right? So there are constraints in respect to that. And I think the way forward is not too dissimilar to what Nick was suggesting, which is, I think a sort of a light touch agency, almost like UN Women, to convene around education that brings everyone together, would be a good thing. But I think, and this comes back to Desmond's point in a second, the likelihood of that happening is pretty limited at the moment. So the question is, how can you achieve something similar by bringing the agencies and others together in a more coordinated way, in a way that adds value that the current SDG steering committee, etc., doesn't, and provides more real leverage. I mean, the irony of the situation in respect of the return to nationalism is we're trying to fix this global issue at the time when commitment to working globally is at an all-time low. So I accept Desmond's point. But I suspect that shouldn't stop us, but it is definitely an impediment. So I was talking to some of our friends in different donors about the possibility of a coalition on the willing on back to basics, right? But I'm going to try to go back to basics. Pre-primary, get the MDG done, and support the countries furthest behind. And they all said, great idea, no appetite, right? So a new emergence of that. Ironically, the country who could best lead that would be the United States, because it reflects their aid priorities. But right now, no one would follow. That is the perennial challenge there in the international community in respect to that one. On the last point, and Sally laid the foundation perfectly in response to the question of sort of migration. So. One thing that has happened over the last few years is the international community is committed to a new way of dealing with population movements. Now, again, we're not doing the best job, but we have the New York Declaration on Migrants and Refugees, and the Global Compact on Refugees, and the Global Compact on Safe and Orderly Migration, all of which have been agreed. The Compact on Refugees has very progressive commitments in respect of education, including the commitment to get refugees who cross an international border seeking protection back into school in no more than 3 months, right? So, amongst other things, including quality education, better ECCD. Now what we're trying to do is crowd people in to work out what the operational plan is to deliver that. And guess what? There are only 4 million out-of-school refugee kids in the world. It's quite a big number, but comparatively speaking, it's not that big, right? I just think that's really doable. So although I appreciate Anya's point to look bigger and wider for inspiration, I also think about the art of the possible. And I am now selling in to all of you and others, couldn't we all agree a plan to get those 4 million kids into school? And that's exactly what the Global Refugee Forum in December, convened by UNHCR, is designed to do. That is its purpose, just on education, but on other areas. And so what we're doing, and I brought our costed plan. So we've got a costed plan which says how you could do this, right? So you can take this away. And our aim now is to get people to say what they can commit to and what the needs are and what the pledges are that they'll make in December against those needs. The worst possible situation is we'll have a meeting in Geneva in December, convened by UNHCR, and well-meaning, fantastic donors, NGOs like us and philanthropists will come and say, we're shipping 1,000 iPads to Jordan, right? Because that will happen. Unless we agree that we need to start with needs and pledge need against those needs so that they are closed, right? And that's what we're calling the international community to do. And it feels to me, in the scheme of all of this, if this was too much for you, and it looks like we can't get anywhere, we could act on this one and get at least some of those kids who are out of school and refugees into school with that connection.